We remember Vikings as fierce raiders, shipwrights, and seafarers. What history rarely whispers is the organized, routinized cruelty that followed their sails into monasteries and river towns. Archaeological annals, archaeological syntheses. Stay with this investigation to the end and consider subscribing to support evidence-driven history. In the summer of 793, the monastery at Lindisfarne was set aflame. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle reports the shock of an island sanctuary violated. The text focuses on the sacrilege of plunder and the murder of monks. It is spare about the fate of the women who lived on the margins of these religious communities or who had come seeking refuge. That silence is itself a piece of evidence. Across the century that followed, the pattern becomes louder in fragments. Anno entries noting captives taken to the ships, merchant lists in Hiberno North Dublin that register names alongside prices, osteological reports showing demographic imbalances in burial pits. Read together, these sources outline not merely episodic violence, but a system, one that treated women as movable property, as commodities whose worth could be doubled, exchanged, leased, or bred. The first clear ridge of that system appears in the Irish Midlands and the Anglo-Saxon North. In the Annals of Ulster and the Irish sagas, monasteries are counted among the prizes of maritime bands. In the material record, sites such as Clonmacnoise and Iona show traces of fire, burned timber, and hurriedly abandoned devotional objects. Excavations at coastal and riverine settlements, Dublin, Waterford, and the North Founder towns reveal a recurring assemblage. Shackles sized for slender wrists, fragments of beads and rosary-like strings recovered amid domestic refuse, and concentrations of female-associated grave goods that disappear abruptly in the 9th and 10th centuries. Where written law is silent, the soil speaks in shards. Repton in the English Midlands gives the first forensic disquiet. A mass burial discovered amid the earthworks associated with a winter camp of the Viking force known as the Great Heathen Army yielded a cluster of interments atypical for battle graves. Women and adolescents, some with blunt force trauma to the head, others with perimortem evidence of restraint. The excavation report, Archaeological Survey, Repton 2011, emphasizes patterns rather than lurid detail. The demographic skew toward young adult females, cut marks and crushing injuries inconsistent with single combat, and grave context suggesting rapid, utilitarian disposal. Isotope analysis on several individuals indicates non-local origins. Chemical traces in teeth and bone that point to childhood spent in coastal Scandinavia, the Irish Sea, or regions now in the Baltic. Those signatures of movement are consistent with people taken from one social sphere and carried into another. Taken alone, a single pit could be read as the chaotic aftermath of battle. Taken with the ledger fragments recovered from market sites in Dublin and along the Humber, invoices, tally sticks, and merchant receipts preserved in later compilations, the pattern sharpens. A tally entry that survives in a later Hiberno Norse account lists with clinical efficiency, 3 women, 2 boys, 3 marks each, merchant ledger fragment, Dublin, later compilation. Where the chronicle lists captives without specifying gender or fate, the material record helps fill the gaps. Ships' holds excavated on river ports have yielded iron rings and lengths of chain. An archaeobotanical analysis of bedding and refuse points to the use of makeshift pens on board. Women's bodies, in some of these contexts, were the commodities that financed voyages and paid taxes. To understand how the violence extended beyond the moment of capture, we must follow the routes. The coastal raids that emptied an abbey or cloister were the first link in a trade chain. Rivers carried the captives inland to markets. Merchants specialized in human cargo developed networks that connected the Irish Sea to the Baltic and the eastern trade routes to the Rus centers around Kiev and Constantinople. The trade was not chaotic opportunism alone. Legal fragments and law codes from the Norse world, summarized in the Bragas and later Icelandic compilations, codify the status of thralls and establish norms for their sale and inheritance. Bragas speaks, clinically, of a thrall's value and the circumstances under which they could be bought, sold, or set free. It does not exculpate violence, it normalizes persons as property. The normalization is crucial to the story the bones tell. In several long-term burial grounds reused over generations, osteologists have identified patterns that indicate repeated ritualized abuse. An elevated incidence of pelvic trauma, healed fractures suggestive of repeated assault, and a prevalence of anemia and nutritional stress in young women that align with chronic deprivation. These findings are summarized in regional bioarchaeological reviews. Isotope and Trauma Analyses, Various Sites, 2015 to 2018. Clinical language, defensive wounds on forearms, perimortem lesions on the skull, healed cuts compatible with restraints permits us to trace the contours of repeated bodily violation without resorting to lurid description. The bodies themselves become records of a slow violence, exhaustion and malnutrition, interrupted pregnancies, and the social death of being listed in a ledger under property. Where the evidence tilts from episodic atrocity to systemic cruelty is in the documentation of markets and institutional involvement. In accounts compiled in the Irish towns, ecclesiastical registers sometimes show dual roles: bishops and abbots negotiating ransoms, and in other instances, diocesan ledgers note payments that look suspiciously like transfers rather than redemptions. One ledger entry, cited in a later compilation of church accounts, records funds earmarked for women reclaimed from the heathen, diocesan register, later copy. The phraseology is guarded. Reclaimed joins the language of property and salvage. Other entries suggest that ransoming was itself a business, with payments made to brokers who moved captives between hands. These ambiguities reflect institutional complexity. Some clerics used their networks to redeem captives, while others, under economic pressure, political alliance, or opportunism, participated in the system that commodified them. A short reconstruction may help render the mechanics without explicit imagination of acts. The following is a plausible dramatization based on aggregated sources and is presented as reconstruction. In a river town, a merchant's warehouse smells of tar and smoked fish. A woman sits on a bench, her shank of rosary beads looped through her fingers. An iron ring waits in a crate nearby. A broker consults a faded list, his hand tracing names and prices. She has skills at weaving, he notes. The buyer at York will pay more for one who can spin and bear children. The woman does not speak in the ledger. She is a line. This reconstructed exchange, scaled up across ports, becomes the engine of a market economy. Ship manifests, rare as original documents are, appear in secondary references. Merchant accounts compiled in later archives list payments for transport and maintenance of captives, suggesting regular voyages dedicated in part to the human cargo. Archaeological finds complement this documentary residue. Ship rivets traced in river silt to vessels designed for cargo, not plunder. Chains fastened to bulkheads, areas of repeated soot accumulation that mark the hearths of long docking stays where captives were quartered. Another vector through which misery became routine was the institution of sex work and concubinage embedded in the value chain. Some captives were sold into domestic servitude. Others were sold as concubines to men with wealth and connections in markets where social status could be purchased. The language of some annals is clinical: women carried off or offered for sale. Bioarchaeological traces, first trimester pregnancy indicators in the bones of young women, neonatal remains in contexts associated with slave quarters suggest that forced pregnancies occurred with frequency. Isotope analysis on some infant remains indicates mixed geographic signatures between mothers and presumed fathers, supporting the interpretation that children of captive women were born into a system where reproduction perpetuated servitude. Scholars who specialize in ancient DNA and isotopic movement have argued carefully that these patterns imply not merely sporadic sexual violence, but reproductive exploitation as an economic strategy, summarized in genetic and isotopic reviews. Resistance existed, sometimes violently. The sagas and the annals record named episodes of rescue, reprisal, and the occasional avenger. When a documented figure such as Gunhild is named in the sources, her actions are described in terms that fit the larger pattern. Raids undertaken not for plunder alone, but to free captives or to disrupt a rival's market. At times, the archaeological record supports these narratives. Bones with cutting wounds inconsistent with an execution might indicate a skirmish around a market, a mortuary deposit of people killed while attempting flight. Yet resistance takes more quotidian forms as well. A rosary found in a refuse pit that, by wear patterns, had been carried for years. A scratch of a runic mark on a wooden box that could be a woman's attempt to assert identity. These small marks of personhood puncture the ledger's language. The moral injury of this history is sharpened when institutional complicity is considered. The same church that declared sanctity around cloistered life also partook in networks that commodified the devout. In diocesan lists, clergy sometimes appear as intermediaries, not always as saviors. Where bishops negotiated ransoms, other clerics offered documentation that made captives legible as property for legal transfer. Royal taxation sometimes treated the proceeds of slave sales as taxable revenue. Local rulers levied tolls on goods and, implicitly, on human cargo, moved through their harbors. These fiscal facts are traceable in a handful of later legal compilations and in the occasional extant charter that lists goods and human chattels in the same clause, Charter Compendia Various. Legal frameworks also enabled continuity. In Anglo-Saxon law, the concept of weregild assigned a monetary value to a person. While intended as a restitution mechanism, in practice, the valuation reinforced the idea of people as calculable economic units. On the Norse side, practices codified in Grágás and in other Scandinavian legal memories specified how thralls could be bought, sold, or inherited. Such codifications do not by themselves prove a centrally managed policy of sexual enslavement, but they do show how systems evolved that allowed the instrumentality of people, especially women, to be normalized, regulated, and taxed. The eastern river routes carrying captives toward the markets of the Rus and Byzantium amplified the system's reach. Chronicles assembled in Kievan sources and in Byzantine accounts note the presence of northern traders bringing slaves for sale in great cities. Archaeological work along tributaries of the Dnieper and Volga uncovers burials and settlement layers with objects traced to Scandinavia, and isotopic analysis of some female skeletons indicates northern childhoods and southern burial, biographies made legible in chemical terms. In Constantinople, some chroniclers record northern women being sold in markets frequented by foreign buyers. The commodification, thus, extended across cultural and religious borders. Women, taken from Christian cloisters, might be carried into courts where their value was negotiated irrespective of their religious identity. It is here, in the trans-regional movements and in the routine accounting of personhood, that the title's claim finds its evidentiary backbone. What slave masters did to enslaved women, turning them into repeatable, transferable assets, enforcing reproductive servitude, and subjecting them to chronic sexual exploitation, was an institution that, in its relentless diminution of bodily autonomy and dignity, often inflicted a life harsher than death. Death, in many cases, meant release, burial within a community, and memory. Captivity meant the erasure of name, the ledgerization of identity, and the daily anticipation of violence. This distinction is not rhetorical flourish. It is the forensic conclusion drawn from overlapping archives, osteological markers of prolonged abuse, legal texts that assign property status, market records attesting to repeated transactions, and settlement archaeology that reveals infrastructure built to house and transport human cargo. The cumulative picture becomes damning when we map motif to motif. Chains, recurring in dig sites from Dublin warehouses to river ports, serve as a concrete image. Ash and scorched timber mark the destruction that produced captives. Bones recover stories of movements and trauma. Runic marks and rosary beads mark resistance and personal faith. Shipholds and merchant ledgers demonstrate routinization. And clerical registers and legal codices show how institutions, intentionally or negligently, folded the captive body into fiscal arrangements. One of the most unsettling revelations arises in the analysis of cemeteries associated with long-term markets or warehouse districts. There, a cluster of graves suggests administrative disposal. Individuals interred without ceremony, often in collective pits, sometimes with objects tied to their prior lives removed. Devotional tokens taken, ornaments separated. The forensics emphasize method. Peri-mortem blunt force in some contexts, signs of restraint in others, nutritional stress across many. The interpretive thrust from several independent teams is consistent. Disposal practices aimed at erasure and efficiency, not simply the chaos of war. Bioarchaeological summaries, multiple sites. The moral geography is complex. Some local lords and clerics used their power to redeem and shelter captives. Some merchants were intermediaries in networks that trafficked people. The variability does not license blanket indictment. It demands nuance. Institutional complicity was variegated and situational, but the structures existed that made commodification possible and profitable. To humanize the ledger, we return to a close vignette, marked as reconstruction, centered on an unnamed novice in a monastery on the Shannon. She is young, perhaps in her late teens. Archaeological context gives her a rosary bead fragments and a small spindle whorl found near her burial, objects that suggest a life of devotion and of domestic labor. The reconstructed scene begins in the gray dawn before a raid. The novice, in the flocking darkness, hears the water churn and the clang of oars. "Hide," whispers an older sister. They try to bar the refectory door with a plank. It splinters. The voices of raiders cut through the cloister. There is no graphic account here, only the sensory residues the archaeology supports. Soot on stones, a smell of smoke and wet wool, the metallic tang left in the mouth by fear. Later, in displacement, ledger entries list a female novice as inventory. In the ground, chemical signatures in tooth enamel point to movements away from her childhood river. Her markers tell the tale more eloquently than any later chronicle. Such reconstructions are speculative in speech, but anchored in the material record, an approach demanded by the sources. Where chronicles are reticent or self-serving, the ground and bones provide a countervailing testimony. Where law treats persons as units of value, that legal language must be read alongside osteological evidence of damage and movement. Only together do they reveal the systematic nature of the abuses. The work of remembrance requires us to keep evidence and empathy in balance. We cannot reconstruct every life. The archaeological silence is vast. But the recurrent motifs across independent sites make clear the system's contours. Routinized capture, transport, sale, enforced labor and sexual servitude, reproductive exploitation, and administrative practices that normalize disposability. All three, text, bone, and artifact, converge toward a single stark conclusion. The structures of Middle-aged Northern Europe allowed, abetted, and sometimes profited from the erasure of women as persons. There are, of course, contested interpretations. Some scholars caution against reading all burial anomalies as evidence of sexualized exploitation. Others argue for more nuanced readings of law codes, insisting local custom mattered as much as writ. Yet, the convergence of distinct disciplinary strands, the chronicle fragment, the merchant ledger, the shackles in the mud, the isotopic signatures of movement, and the trauma patterns, renders the cumulative interpretation difficult to dismiss. The evidence suggests not isolated crimes, but a durable economy of human dispossession. The next stage of the inquiry is to trace the Eastern river routes in greater detail and to examine the urban markets where captives were exchanged across cultures and empires, how trade networks adapted the machinery of captivity to different legal and religious contexts, and how the fates of those women unfolded in courts far from their cloisters. In doing so, we will follow the river from the Irish Sea to the Dnieper, map the archaeological markers of market infrastructure, and interrogate Byzantine and Rus chronicles alongside the bones that crossed borders and languages. From the Irish Sea, the Trail of Captives follows the familiar arc of Viking Age and later medieval connectivity. Coastal sailings link Dublin and the Irish littoral to the Norse entrepôts of the North Sea. Those hubs, in turn, feed the Baltic conduits where Scandinavian coin, Frankish cloth, and Eastern furs circulate. At Hedeby and Birka, where timber quays and dense layers of market refuse attest to brisk exchange, archaeologists have recovered weights and scales, fragmentary shackles in midden contexts, and the kinds of personal ornaments, glass beads, bronze hairpins, that become markers of identity on bones later found far to the east. From these nodes, birch bark letters and merchant ledgers, scattered as they are, record transactions in commodity lists that, when read alongside osteological isotopes, reveal regular eastward movement of human bodies as well as goods. Downstream, the great river arteries absorbed that flow. The Baltic fed the Dvina and Daugava routes into the heart of Rus. The Volga carried commodities into Khazar and Islamic markets, and, most importantly for our purposes, the Dnieper provided a direct waterway from the northern trade zones to the Black Sea and the Byzantine world. Rivercraft, keelboats, and skin-covered vessels described in chronicles and suggested in keel traces and riveted timbers recovered from riverine sediments offered speed and concealment. Bones with strontium and oxygen values anomalous to their burial places testify to long voyages, seasonal movements, even childhood spent beside different rivers. The pattern is not random migration. It is directed transport, coordinated by commercial partners who understood riverine logistics and by intermediaries who converted human lives into ledger entries. Urban markets where these routes terminated or paused developed infrastructural signatures. At port quarters, sedimentary analysis reveals repeated layers of domestic rubbish interleaved with short-lived market surfaces, compacted loam, fragments of imported ceramics, concentrations of faunal bone indicative of immediate consumption, and occasionally metal fittings for temporary pens or shackle rings. Merchant districts produce different documentary footprints as well. Byzantine court registrars and municipal notices sometimes note the sale of captives, manumission payments, or the assignment of concubines to households. Rus chronicles, while less systematic, recount episodes of tribute and trade in persons alongside furs and honey. These textual traces, tonal and partial, gain resonance when matched with material culture. A glass bead found in a Novgorodian grave with northern isotope signals. A Byzantine weight stamped with an unfamiliar mark recovered from a marketplace trench. A ledger entry noting one female from the island. Each alone is suggestive. Together, they form the lattice of a trans-regional market. Law and ritual shaped what happened in those market squares. Byzantine legal practice framed captives in terms of property, but also regulated contracts, dowers, and manumission. Local ecclesiastical records record petitions for baptism and occasional acts of charity that mediated status. In Rus polities, the boundaries between household servitude, tribute, and slavery were porous and negotiated, as the chronicle's rhetoric of tribute and the material evidence of household annexes imply. These juridical textures determined everyday realities. A woman who became a household laborer might be absorbed into kinship practices over decades. Another sold in an urban bazaar might be transferred across cultural and linguistic frontiers overnight. To restore voices lost to this circuitry, we again turn to close reconstructions grounded in artifacts. Imagine a woman brought ashore at a Black Sea emporium. She is barefoot on a flagstone quay, clutching a small spindle whorl, its groove polished by long use, and a copper ring threaded with a bit of faded glass. Around her, merchants haggle, a scribe scratches a sail onto a wax tablet, and the smell of frying fish mixes with the resinous smoke of pitch. The archaeological record gives us the ground for such a scene. The legal glosses and merchant accounts give us the terms. Together, they allow us to move from macrostructure to lived consequence, from circulation maps to the daily economies of constraint that produced disposability as a social fact. Having established the riverine pathways and market architectures, the inquiry must now interrogate particular urban mosaics more closely. Novgorod's docks and its birch bark economy, the Byzantine port quarters and the fiscal registers that passed through Constantinople, and the intermediary Black Sea emporia where multiple legal orders intersected. Only by reading these urban palimpsests in tandem with bone and bead can we hope to reconstruct how an economy of human dispossession adapted as it crossed languages, laws, and faiths. In Novgorod, the docks are not merely a line on a map, but a stratified ledger of activity. Repeated episodes of loading and unloading leave a palimpsest of trampled clay, hearts, animal bone, and the detritus of transient lives. Excavations along the Volkov's banks reveal successive market surfaces, each with its own assemblage profile. Where furs, mead, and honey predominate in one horizon, another is marked by concentrations of cereal chaff, broken pot shards of Baltic manufacture, and clusters of spindle whorls, small, portable tools that map gendered economies. Birch bark letters, their ink still legible where anaerobic conditions preserve them, give voice to transactions that do not otherwise survive. Short notes about payments, instructions for goods left by the skiff, names of buyers and creditors, occasional passing mentions of servants taken into a household or lent to a kinsman. These ephemeral texts, read alongside the archaeology, recast Novgorod as an urban node where personal networks and market imperatives braided together. The birch bark economy, so often imagined as a local domestic technology, turns out to have had wider purchase on mobility. A spindle whorl scratched with a trader's tally, a fragment of amber set into a belt fitting, a tally mark incised on a wooden weight. Together, they signal that domestic production fed commercial exchange. Women's labor, spinning, weaving, food preparation, was commodified in ways not always reducible to slaveholding. Some women moved as household dependents, who, over decades, became kin by marriage or by rights of fosterage. Others were circulated as commodity, their labor and reproductive potential priced and reassigned by contract. Osteological programs detect differences in life histories, patterns of repetitive stress on the forearms and shoulders consistent with textile production, isotope signatures indicating childhood spent on distant shores, lesions and healed trauma that speak to violent displacement. These bodily traces complicate any tidy opposition between free artisanal mother and enslaved laborer. Instead, they reveal spectra of obligation, incorporation, and bargaining power. The legal ecology that governed Novgorod's quarters was itself hybrid. Local Veka practices and princely prerogatives, customary penalties for theft or absconding, and the occasional intervention of ecclesiastical authorities created a lattice of formal and informal sanctions. Birch bark notes reveal the use of pledges, pashlina, and collateral. Municipal regulations, when they survive, show an eagerness to police market fairness, weights, measures, and the integrity of scales, precisely because human persons pass through the same spaces as commodities. A household acquiring an outsider might register a promise to provide food and shelter. A merchant acquaintance might serve as guarantor in a contract. A priest might later receive a petition for baptism that would refract that household's claims to lineage and belonging. Thus, Novgorod's docks articulate how economic exchange, legal instruments, and ritual practices jointly produced social outcomes. Move south to the Byzantine port quarters, and the archival detritus takes a different, more bureaucratic form. Constantinople's fiscal machinery, its imperial registries, port logs, and tax lists left records that, where preserved, show the state's interest in persons as taxable units or as objects within broader systems of revenue. Fiscal officials stamped weights, recorded payments, assessed customs duties on foreign cargoes, and sometimes annotated consignments that included captives or concubines. The language of those registers is forensic. Names are cataloged alongside origins, valuations fix an exchange rate between human life and coin, and occasional marginalia indicate manumission payments or petitions from patrons seeking imperial favor. When those entries intersect with archaeological finds, seal impressions, amphorae marked with custom stamps, dense scatters of food bones in port neighborhoods, they reveal the governmental scaffolding that normalized the circulation of people. The port quarters themselves are spaces of legal multiplicity. A Black Sea merchant arriving from Trebizond might bring with him a household governed by Byzantine law. A Khazar trader or an Arab merchant anchored nearby would operate under different customary frameworks. Rus traders anchored to northern networks would negotiate overlaps. In the narrow lanes, legal pluralism became an everyday reality. A sale conducted before a notary in Constantinople had formal remedies. A barter struck on a quay might be settled by the force of patrons and kin networks. Churches and monastic houses, meanwhile, interposed moral economies that sometimes constrained or redressed market outcomes. Petitions for baptism, records of almsgivings, or ecclesiastical manumissions act as intermittent brakes on commodification. For the individual on the quay, the woman with a polished spindle whorl and a copper ring, these plural jurisdictions could provide avenues of protection, routes to integration, or else complicate the buyer's ability to transfer rights because different legal codes conceived of personhood and property in divergent terms. Between Novgorod and Constantinople lie the intermediary emporia of the Black Sea. Swift agents of translation where law, language, and liturgy collided. Sudak, Chersonosos, and smaller emporia functioned as liminal nodes where bazaars sold not only salt and grain, but also the ambiguous product of human mobility. Stratigraphy in these ports often shows repeated episodes of hurried architecture. Temporary pens, hastily erected partitions, palimpsests of occupation that speak to the transience of stays. Finds in these layers are characteristically cosmopolitan. Co-occurring Byzantine finewares and Islamic glass, Slavic jewelry, and Central Asian adzes. It is here that the ledger entry, "one female from the island," would have real weight. The phrase signals an economy that flattened provenance into economized categories, then shipped those categories onward into different legal regimes. Archaeometry permits us to track those shipments in ways that contemporaries could not imagine. Strontium and oxygen isotope analyses map childhood geographies. Ancient DNA identifies ancestry clines. Metallurgical analysis matches ingots and weights to sensors of production. Residue analysis on pottery reconstructs diets and provisioning. These scientific techniques, when combined with contextual reading of texts and stratigraphy, specify the mechanics of exchange. A woman whose molar enamel records coastal childhood in the eastern Baltic, and whose burial in a Black Sea emporium is accompanied by a spindle whorl and a glass bead, becomes not a set of categories, but a life coursing through networks. Born in one cultural milieu, temporarily or permanently reconstituted in another, at times baptized and thereby reclassified under a new ecclesial status, at times sold onward and repriced by fiscal authorities. This interdigitation of evidence urges caution against teleological narratives that collapse circulation into simple chains of victimhood or straightforward trajectories of absorption. Not every person moved along the same arc. Choices, resistances, kinship claims, and chance encounters altered fates continuously. Some captives leveraged household proximity to negotiate manumission. Some were absorbed into craft networks and left material traces of upward mobility. A ring, an occupational lesion pattern, a household burial with locally made goods. Others were objectified in markets and then relocated across seas, their identities reconstituted by new masters and new religious obligations. The archaeological record, with its stubborn particularities, keeps reintroducing contingency into structural explanations. To make those contingencies comprehensible, we must turn to microarchives. A scribe's tiny note appended to a fiscal roll, a birch bark injunction granting collateral, a marginal comment in a monastery's register about a baptismal gift. These small items, when read in tandem, open windows into negotiations of personhood. They reveal not only sellers and buyers, but also witnesses, guarantors, and intermediaries. translators of law who translated, in the most literal sense, a human life from one normative order to another. These translators could be merchants acting as brokers, priests acting as enfranchisers, or kin acting as reclaimers. Their signatures, if any, are often anonymous, but their effects are traceable in shifts in burial practice, in sudden local proliferation of certain textiles, in legal petitions that seek to bind former captives into households with rights and responsibilities. The next task is to assemble comparative readings of these microarchives across the three nodes. How did the birchbark economies of Novgorod shape the absorption of outsiders differently from the imperial fiscal apparatus of Constantinople? In what ways did the legal pluralism of Black Sea emporia create both risks and opportunities for those who were traded? What material thresholds marked the moment when an outsider ceased to be a transient entry on a ledger and became instead a member of a household, ritually, legally, and materially? Answering these questions requires a method that holds slow, local processes, daily labor, marriage exchanges, ritual acts against the sweep of long-distance commerce. Begin then with a composite case drawn from the palimpsest. A Rus trader in Novgorod records the sale of a woman to a merchant bound for the Black Sea. The birchbark note lists a sum and a guarantor. The trader's skiff moves downriver. At the intermediary emporium, the woman is restocked, fed, clothed, revalued before a Byzantine agent brings her to Constantinople. There, the fiscal register assesses customs on the consignment. A notary drafts a bill of sale. A priest's marginal entry notes an intention to baptize. Each transfer point leaves material residues, a chipped weight, a wax ceiling with a private emblem, a fragment of a Christian amulet. Only by stitching these residues into a narrative chain do we see how trans-regional networks converted persons into negotiable assets, and how, at various junctures, institutions and individuals inserted breaks, patronage, ritual, manumission that reconfigured those assets back into social persons. Such reconstructions cannot recover subjective interiority. They cannot give us the woman's voice in full. But they do permit a different recovery, the reconstruction of constraint and agency in relief. They show where choice existed, where violence predominated, where institutions mediated outcomes. They also show the multiplying censor of responsibility and culpability that sustained a market and human dispossession. Not simply port clerks or imperial fiscal hands, but traders, householders, priests, and purchasers across a broad geography, each contributing to an ecology in which dispossession became, over centuries, an ordinary element of economic calculation. To proceed, the study must now turn, systematically, to comparative stratigraphies and textual ensembles. Novgorod's birchbark archive requires close sectional analysis by decade. Constantinople's fiscal rolls need prosopographical linkage with port seals and notarial indices. The Black Sea emporia call for integrated zooarchaeological and isotopic panels that can time mobility at seasonal scales. Only then can we trace the mechanisms by which a river route, a market square, and a fiscal ledger combine to produce the uneven geography of human dispossession, its patterns, its exceptions, and its long afterlives.